Coming up this week on The Right Side, context regarding Jason Kenney and GSAs in Alberta. Big money hits BC politics, and the BC Conservatives face NDP infiltrators. Plus, how high of a carbon tax would be necessary to reach environmental targets. This is The Right Side, Episode 10, recorded Saturday, April 1st, 2017. The dangers of big money, vote splitting, and carbon taxes. Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us for The Right Side. Shane and Patrick here this week, as per usual. Welcome back.
Good to be back on this fine first day of April.
Yeah, very foolish day for some reasons and other reasons. Sometimes you get fooled by your own computer and Microsoft, don't you?
Yeah, exactly. Sometimes you have to wait an extra little bit longer just because of technical issues, but here we are, as promised.
On The Right Side. All right. So The Right Side is, of course, a podcast that you are listening to on iTunes or our website at rightsidenews.ca. And we endeavor to cut through the bias and sensationalism that plagues the mainstream media in what appears to be an increasingly number of stories every week. And that's why we are, of course, here to cut through this and say what exactly needs to be said about these issues and try and provide some clarity as to aspects that the mainstream media might have missed. So, ready to dive straight in this week for an interesting story out of Alberta that is getting way too much attention.
I agree with you on that. It's been heard all the way around the country, nationally, on national news and local news, and tell me about it, Shane.
Yeah, I mean, this headline is Jason Kenney slammed for comments about gay-straight alliances. Anybody who has been watching Alberta will remember that I believe it was in the fall of 2015, or maybe it was 2014, I think. Alberta brought in what was known as Bill 10, the Gay-Straight Alliances Bill, that allowed schools to form gay-straight alliances and mandated that if a student requested one, the school needed to provide one, and that the parents need not necessarily be notified about this. So this week there was a story. Of course, it came from an interview with Jason Kenney, and it was a post-media editorial board on Tuesday in which Jason Kenney was asked about Bill 10 and whether parents should be notified if their child joins a gay-straight alliance at a school. Now, what Kenney said in the interview is being taken wildly out of context. In the interview, he said, "I have said that I would not repeal Bill 10, if that's what you're asking me, and I do, however, think that parents have a right to know what's going on in their kids' schools unless the parents are abusive." So this was taken out of context by the mainstream media to say that regardless of what the Gay-Straight Alliance legislation says, parents should be notified of what's happening in their schools with their children. Now,
and I think before we go further, I think it's also important to note what actually is a gay-straight alliance, because many people might not actually know what that is. And it's basically a student-run club, usually in a high school or a middle school, which aims to provide a safe place for students to meet, support each other, and talk about issues related to sexual orientation, gender identity and expression, and to work to end homophobia and transphobia in the education system. That is defined by their official organization.
Right. And, there has always been some question about whether or not parents should be, completely kept in the loop of what their children are doing at school. And, this ultimately comes down to joining a club at school, because that's what they're essentially going to be marketed as in schools. And when you think about it, does a parent get notified when a child joins the chess club? The child might tell the parents about that, or say the math club. But at the end of the day, the parents are the parents, not the schools. So there's going to be some natural discussion going on between parents and teachers and students about this. And I don't think it's unnatural to assume that if the parents are in a good relationship and there's no abuse happening at home on this issue, that the children might not necessarily say that they have joined one of these clubs. So this entire issue was taken out of context. You see all the usual suspects coming forward with this story right off the bat. Alberta Education Minister David Eggen said he was, quote-unquote, disturbed by Kenney's remarks. Condemnation also came from former MLA Laurie Blakeman, who introduced Bill 10. She was defeated in the 2015 election. Also, Katie Lang chimed in with a sarcastic tweet. "You're gay, aren't you?" at J. Kenney. So as you can see, this did draw truly national attention about this. And, it is a story that really serves to show what the mainstream media does when it comes to dealing with these issues, and conservative politicians in general trying to pigeonhole them into a position that they might not necessarily have taken. It's not until the very end of this article that, after they cite, Education Minister David Eggen, the MLA Laurie Blakeman, who brought the bill in, and numerous other people, that we finally get down to the statement that Jason Kenney released on his Facebook page, in which he actually includes the transcript from this full interview. So we have a link to that in the show notes at rightsidenews.ca. But here it basically goes on to say that Jason Kenney says, I don't think it's necessary to notify parents about what's going on. And, if there is an abusive relationship happening and the children bring that up in schools, there are already safety nets in place to deal with abusive parents when a child notifies someone at a school, a teacher, or a principal. So basically what's going on here is you're seeing a complete distortion of the issue when, first and foremost, Jason Kenney will not repeal Bill 10 if he becomes premier, and he feels that the current structure in place to deal with abusive parents is already enough should a child feel that they're being abused at home for this issue. And the example he gives about this is that why there needs to be communication is quoted in his statement here from the interview, and I'll just read a bit of it. He says, I'll give you a practical example I'm thinking of. A mother approached me in January after a public town hall. She was quite distraught, and she told me that her 12-year-old autistic daughter had been put into counseling and referred to a boy, given a boy's name in school. But none of this information had been shared with the parents. So for months, the child was being treated as a boy in school and a girl at home, creating even more problems, confusion, and tension. And eventually the parents learned about this by accident, and they were just horrified to hear this. And it basically goes on to say, a further follow-up question here. So if a student who is not autistic, who is coming out, joins a GSA, would you require the parents be notified? Jason Kenney says, I think generally speaking, parents have a right to know what their kids are doing at school. If there's evidence that the parents are abusive, then they shouldn't be involved.
Now, for those of us that aren't as in the know about Alberta politics, what exactly is Bill 10 and what does it have to do with this issue?
So Bill 10 was passed by the former PC government, and it mandates that if a student wants a gay-straight alliance in the school, they should be allowed to have one, and the school board needs to provide one. And should the students join it and they don't want to notify their parents, the school has to abide by that statement that we're not going to notify the parents that you join this. So that's what Bill 10 brings in. And the reason this is such a huge issue is, I think, twofold. The first one being that when Bill 10 first passed, it had the support of the Progressive Conservative Caucus. I think most of it, of course, the Alberta Liberals and the NDP. And the Wild Rose treated it as a free vote. So some of the Wild Rose voted for it, some of them didn't. Some of the PCs voted for it, some didn't. But in the end, it passed. I think the other reason why this is being brought up in Alberta is because in the 2012 election, Wild Rose had a candidate who, mainstream media did some digging and unearthed some Lake of Fire comments about gays. So whenever a new conservative leader comes on the scene, I think the media wants to shake this tree to see if they can get anything to fall like they did in the 2012 election. And that's what they're doing with Jason Kenney. And, in some ways that's really unfair, because if you look at Jason Kenney's record as federal immigration minister, for example, he was a champion for those minorities and bringing them to Canada from areas of the world where they were persecuted. So
and I think
the whole story makes no sense.
Yeah, and I think for a lot of people on the left, he's seen as sort of the old Harper conservative, where he's his own person, really. I mean, it doesn't mean that he is a clone of Harper. Doesn't mean that he's not a clone of Harper. I mean, he's his own person. He has his own ideas, and clearly he has his own plans for the province for if he becomes premier. And I think that they're lumping him in with the same stereotype is quite disingenuous.
Yeah, and I mean, there have been numerous sources outside of the Conservative Party who have said that Jason Kenney was one of the most progressive immigration ministers that the country has ever had, even more progressive than former Liberal immigration ministers. So you can take that for what it's worth. But, I mean, the pure chopping up of the full statement and the quote on this, and the fact we don't get to Jason Kenney's statement containing the actual transcript of the interview until the second to last paragraph of this article, it kind of distorts the aspect of what the media should really be focusing on here. This was a discussion with Jason Kenney. It was not a discussion about other things. It was built up by the usual suspects who, of course, just love to jump on these issues. And anyone in politics who, claims to be or says that they are anti-gay or won't march in a pride parade can expect a full week's news cycle about this. And quite frankly, it's just not fair to Jason Kenney in this case, because that's not what he thinks.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what we got going on in Alberta this week. And, it dominated the news cycle for the first half of the week until some other things happened in Edmonton and Calgary that took it away. But, I would not expect, or I rather would expect this issue to come up again in the 2019 election if he is leader of one of the political parties in that race. So,
which it looks like he will be.
Yeah, depending. But anyways, so idea behind this story is, you got to really read the entire story, and you got to keep in mind that when you're watching this on the evening news, they do not include Jason Kenney's full statement or the full transcript of this interview. They only include the people such as David Egan and Laurie Blakeman who are chastising him for this. So once again, this is the media taking things entirely out of context, hyping things up for bias, sensationalism, and clicks, which we don't like here at the right side. So, what do you got for BC this week?
So, BC, on previous episodes, we've talked about the BC Conservatives and how they are attempting to be sort of a spoiler in the BC election, who is being headlined by the BC Liberal Party, who've been in for 16 years, and the BC NDP, who have been out of power since 2001, but have consistently posted high opposition numbers since then. So, the story that's come out this week that we were both kind of shocked to see, I think, was the headline screaming, "Socialist takeover continues. NDP ties of two BC Conservative candidates raises questions." So, I think for most people in the province, especially most Conservatives, they would expect the BC Conservatives to be center-right free enterprise alternative to the BC Liberal Party. But it was recently revealed that the de facto leader of the BC Conservatives has ties to the BC NDP. John Twigg, who we've talked about previously, is filling this role as the communications secretary on the party board for the Conservatives. But it turns out he was actually the former press secretary for former NDP Premier Dave Barrett, and back in 2011 he also donated to the leadership campaign of current NDP leader John Horgan. Twigg's former NDP colleague David Schreck has also been promoting BC Conservative candidates and the party on Twitter. So I think the BC Conservatives got a bit more coverage back at the end of 2016. Former leader Dan Brooks was fired by a party board led by John Twigg late in 2016 after it was revealed that the meeting Brooks was acclaimed leader at did not achieve quorum, which in party terms like this is a legal technicality. After that, the BC Conservatives were left without a de jure leader heading into the election, and there was and still appears to be no plans to hold a leadership election before the upcoming May provincial election. And they have been shut out of the televised debates, as we talked about a couple episodes ago, and there appears to be no head at the top of the leader list other than this John Twigg. So if we look at a couple of the candidates, there is one called Kay Hale, and she is running for the BC Conservatives this election. And she actually ran for the BC NDP back in 2005 in the new riding of Queensborough in Vancouver. This, however, wasn't really a case of swapping parties because of different ideology. She actually feels that the BC Conservatives are more centrist to the left of the BC Liberals. And also, Vernon Monashee candidate Nels Harrington also is clearly against the former Harper government and has spent time posting memes on his personal Facebook comparing Harper to everybody's favorite German leader, Adolf Hitler. And he also appears to be very much against natural resource development and other things of that nature. Now, I think there's something about this that just highlights the murky and dirty issue and the problem with BC politics that we face right now. So the choice facing conservative or even just fiscally responsible voters is clear. Do they hold their noses and vote for the competent but imperfect BC Liberals, or do they allow the NDP to win through devious vote splitting in a protest vote, much like what happened in Alberta? I think many who lived through the BC NDP governments of the 90s and current Albertans under Rachel Notley know that the choice is clear.
Yeah, and, when you actually have a BC Conservative Party with ties to the NDP, with infiltrators, that kind of thing really doesn't spell great news for a party that, is supposed to be in a period of renewal and rebirth with a new leader. We had similar things happen in the former Progressive Conservative Party here in Alberta, for example. There were lots of people who joined that party under Alison Redford who would have been quite happy in the Alberta NDP. So much so, there was a former Progressive Conservative here, Sandra Jensen, who actually crossed the floor this past fall to sit with the Alberta NDP. So the old Progressive Conservatives held a lot of those similar kind of individuals just because they had been in power for so long, and it was an easy route to power. And I'm thinking maybe that's what the NDP ties are about here in the BC Conservatives, is that, let's see if we can maybe get elected in the BC Conservatives just to maybe split the vote or try and masquerade as a party that's an alternative to the BC Liberals.
Yeah, and probably to try and get probably more conservative voters to vote for them so that they don't vote for the Liberals as well. Because the name of the BC Liberals, people would automatically think that they're a Liberal party that, on the scale of Kathleen Wynne in Ontario or Justin Trudeau nationally or other Liberal parties. But they're really not. They're really amalgamation of conservative and Liberal politicians who are working together in sort of a formal style coalition, basically to keep the NDP out of power. So the NDP it seems like they're trying to use every dirty trick in the book to try and get elected, since they haven't been successful in the past 4 elections to do so.
And, I don't know how many potential seats the BC Conservatives could get out of this. Perhaps 1, maybe 2, probably not even that many. But if it's enough of a vote split, you could definitely cause problems in some of those areas that are, tipping point election districts, right?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, you and I, we did the numbers after the Alberta election, and I think you added it all up, and you found out that if the Wild Rose and the PCs were the same party, NDP would only get a handful of seats at all,
in
and I
Edmonton.
think and they would be in Edmonton, and I think the issue of vote splitting is very real. You look at what happened in 2011 nationally, to use another example. The NDP, the federal NDP, that is, really surged up, and they took a lot of votes away from the Liberals, and I think that is what caused the Conservatives to get a majority, and it caused the Liberals to fall into a sharp decline.
Third party
And
status.
third party status, they weren't. For the first time, neither the Conservatives nor the Liberals were official opposition. And so I think when you look at it in our system, first past the post, it's very real that vote splitting can happen. And I think it's something that voters will have to think about when they go into the election. And when they go into the news and have a look at BC politics in the news. And have we heard much about BC Conservatives? Not really.
Nope.
Haven't been hearing about them at all, but people will see them on the ballot and they say, BC Conservative? Well, I'm a Conservative, I should vote for them. And I think that's what the idea is. They're trying to prey on uninformed voters.
Right. And that uninformed voting is never good because elections have consequences.
Mm-hmm. As we see so many times over the years.
All right. So we're sticking in BC this week. Next up, you got something on big money and hypocrisy. This is going to be fun. What do you got?
Oh, yes. So previously on the show, we've talked about the donation scandal in BC, about how anyone can donate to any amount and how there's not very many rules on it whatsoever. And how the BC NDP have been decrying the Liberal government about this and how they've accepted big money and how this has influenced their politics over the last 16 years. And why on earth haven't they done anything about it? Well, it turns out that the BC NDP leader, John Horgan, is going to hold his major pre-election fundraiser on Thursday night in a posh Vancouver hotel ballroom with 450 or so supporters and would-be allies. And the donors... guessed it, they're paying up to $1,000 a person for a stand-up reception, not even a chicken dinner, with the man who hopes to end the BC Liberals' 16-year-long reign on Election Day in May. The irony about this is that the first piece of legislation that Mr. Horgan has proposed to introduce, if he would become premier, would be designated to get rid of this big money in politics. So Premier Christy Clark, in the last question period exchange of the spring legislative session, deflected attacks on her own Cash for Access fundraising by talking instead about Mr. Horgan's. She said, well, here we have a leader of the opposition that says no one should take donations from corporations, and then he takes donations from corporations. The fact that the two leaders exchanged barbs on the campaign finances in the last one-to-one before the election debates doesn't really mean that this will be a key issue in the campaign. The NDP argue that they can't afford to take the high road at the risk of losing to the well-funded Liberals. Horgan's argument that an opposition party can't be influenced by big money implies that no one who is giving money to his party now might expect to call in the favor if he wins. That's kind of unlikely. As much as the New Democrats are keeping track of who is showing up with a check now, donors will expect to be remembered if this party forms the government on May 9th.
Ay. I am glad that we don't have large corporate and union donations in Alberta or federally anymore, and I do commend the NDP here on doing that because, you just get into this huge mess when you end up having, issues like this, $1,000 per person dinners, just fundraising with the wild, wild west out there. And, I mean, when you look at it, it is entirely hypocritical, and John Horgan should be being speared by the opposition and by the mainstream media and the media in general about this, because I think this is as hypocritical as you can get, aside from, maybe campaigning on a platform and doing the exact opposite. So has there been anything in the mainstream media out there aside from this one story on this?
Other than this one story from the Globe and Mail, I have not seen anything whatsoever about it in either the local newspapers, the provincial newspapers, or even the national papers with their BC section. So, honestly, it just goes to show that when it truly comes down to it, many politicians are very similar in method despite their ideology. I think the fact that big money and big business have there's such a sway in BC politics, I think it's really concerning to voters. And honestly, the NDP are being very hypocritical about this issue. And it shows that John Horgan is self-possessed, more honest than the Liberals' image.
They can't be
trusted. It's not true, and they can't be trusted with the reins of the province if they can't even show that they're
this has to be a major point for the televised debates.
Yeah, and they can't even show that they're an honest alternative to the Liberals when they're doing the exact same thing.
Right. So it looks like from both sides here, if the Liberals play their cards right, they could easily win re-election as long as there's no vote splitting and they campaign correctly against the NDP.
Yeah, and that's what they did last time. I think they did a marvelous campaign last time. All of the polls were saying, oh, they're not going to win. I mean, they thought that Christy Clark wouldn't win because she is and remains an unpopular premier, despite the party being popular. I mean, after all, they won a majority, but she lost her own seat. So, I mean, other than that, I think that they've run a very, very good campaign. But this time it's going to be different, and a lot of people are going to remember what's happened. And as we all know, dynasties don't stay dynasties forever. And they have been in 16 years, and what happens in May is up to the voters and ultimately up to the media who decide to portray these issues in a certain light.
That's right. And, you know, if they play their cards right, they could extend it another 30 years and be the next Alberta Progressive Conservatives.
And we will see if they are able to do that.
Alrighty, well, our final segment of Week Firing Line, this is the segment in which we highlight a news story that really should have gotten more media attention this week, but it didn't. This last John Horgan story was a candidate for that, but of course we opted for the Canada story instead for Firing Line. And the headline here is that following. Secret briefing says up to $300 per ton federal carbon tax by 2050 will be required to meet climate targets. Environment Canada told Catherine McKenna early in her mandate as a minister that a price on carbon would have to go as high as $300 per ton in 2050 for Canada to meet its climate targets, a secret briefing that the National Post has obtained. A $100 per ton tax would need to be in place by 2020. They're aiming for $30 a ton. These targets are the same targets that were set by the former government to reduce levels to 30% below 2005 levels by 2030. The article goes on to say that unless you're going to go further than you've said so far in between the years of 2022 and 2030, Andrew Leach, who is a professor at the University of Alberta, worked at Environment Canada under the previous government and advised Alberta's government on the carbon tax policy, says that the government won't be on track to meet its target, and they're going to need to be more stringent with their policies. And then in the end, we get an estimate of the costs that are claimed by the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. The Canadian Taxpayers Federation is a watchdog group that ensures that taxpayers' dollars submitted to the governments, federal and provincial, are spread effectively. They say that on average, a household could expect to see costs up to $2,500 for family with a $50 per ton price, while estimates from think tanks and other academics put that number closer to $1,500. And this is, of course, with a $50 per ton price on carbon. So you can do the math and multiply that by 6 to get to the potential $300, or double it to get to the potential $100 per ton tax that would need to be in place to reach this ballpark limit by 2020. So, once again, this didn't get much coverage in the media at all, aside from the story in the National Post. Actually, the National Post were the only ones covering this secret briefing. It's also a little bit concerning that the National Post chose to not release the documents that they received on that, in a public format so we could all read them rather than just trusting on reporting. It's not that I don't trust the National Post per se, it's just that I like to read the source documents when I'm working on something like this. But, this is really lowballed compared to what was promised in the campaign. And it kind of goes to show that when you're talking about a carbon taxes don't change the environment, and carbon taxes on their own of the prices that are being brought in really are not enough to offset emissions. They would need to be much higher and much more painful on end users in the economy.
Mm-hmm. And it's widely known that businesses that are slapped with a carbon tax, they're just going to pass on the cost to the consumers. They're as much as they can, at least. They're not going to take the hit themselves.
Right.
I mean, they have to stay competitive, and they have to stay profitable after all.
And I mean, academics also say in this article that other technologies, cap and trade or even carbon capture and storage, can be on the order of the same level of expense as a carbon tax. So when it comes down to it, rather than just looking for efficiencies in the market and going for regulation of those industries with laws rather than taxes, that was the previous government's approach. The businesses are going to be spending more, and they're either going to put that cost onto the consumer or pull out of the area entirely. So ultimately, we're either going to be looking at an increase in the carbon tax, or the government isn't going to be meeting its targets, and the carbon tax will just be seen as another cash grab.
Mm-hmm.
So at the end of the day, it's a question of what do you want? Do you want a carbon tax that's going to, hurt everyone in the economy to reduce emissions by a couple of percent? Or do you want a carbon tax that's ineffective, but it's just going to be a cash grab? And I think the answer to both those questions from anyone who pays this carbon tax is going to be neither. And ultimately, that's why I think a carbon tax is a bad idea.
Yeah, and I think anyone who's looked at what the federal Liberal government has been spending tax money on, I think we're all fairly uncomfortable with giving them even more money to send them into even more debt. I mean, what they're doing is they're just putting deficit after deficit, putting us further and further into debt. Now they've decided they still don't have enough money and they want to put a carbon tax in. You can't take what they're saying about it, we want to help the environment, because it's not about that. It's about money. It's always about money. and basically they want to take this money from the businesses and to fund their own personal projects. And it's really disingenuous the way that the media is not covering this whatsoever.
Exactly. And I mean, when you look at the numbers, it's clear it's not affecting the economy or the carbon output from the industries in the way that they want, and it's just lining the pockets of government with cash. Anyways, that's the firing line for this week, and your right news rundown for April 1st, 2017. That leaves us with word of the week, and you got a great one for us, don't you?
Yeah, I do have a good one. The word of the week this week is quorum. So a lot of people might have heard us talking about quorum earlier when we're referring to the BC Conservative leadership race. But they might not know what it actually is. So a quorum is the number of officers or members of a body that, when duly assembled, is legally competent to transact business. Now, that's a lot of words for what's very simple. Basically, it's the minimum number of people that an association or organization can have before they can do anything that's legally binding. So, such as a legislative assembly, parliament, or the Senate, or even the Supreme Court of Canada. They all need quorums to be able to conduct business. So a quorum is meant to protect against unrepresentative action in the name of the body by a small number of people, which basically means that there has to be a certain number of people that are able to be there for anything
to exercise their vote in order to represent their constituents or taxpayers or board members. You get the idea.
Yeah. So, I mean, quorums can be in they can be different numbers in different scenarios. For instance, in the Supreme Court of Canada, you have to have 5 out of 9 judges to be able to do anything, which is a majority. Now in the House of Commons in Canada, I believe it's fairly low, actually, surprisingly low.
Yeah, weren't we discussing this? It was something around 20 MPs, give or take.
Yeah, it is 20 MPs. In the United Kingdom, for instance, it's 40 out of 650. So it's only about 5% or so. And I believe in the Senate it is actually, I think it's 12, which is it's quite crazy.
That's an interesting number, but I don't want to go on too far about why these numbers exist. I have a few ideas in my head. Maybe if one day we introduce a quiz segment, we could bring that up.
Well, basically, the reason why they exist is because they wanted a low number, because back when the Constitution was created in 1867, it was much more difficult for all the MPs to be able to get to Ottawa. But here we are in 2017, and we have, jumbo jets and cars that go very fast, and lots of big population centers that are able to get to other population centers very quickly. It's just one of those things in the Constitution that makes it that is just created for the 1800s and not for the 2000s.
Yeah, it hasn't been updated since, but it works just fine.
Yep.
All right. Well, that's it for The Right Side this week on April 1st, 2017. Thank you for joining us, everyone, and sharing your time with us. If you want to interact with us, you can find us at RightSideCA on Twitter. Our show notes are available at rightsidenews.ca, and if you want the podcast delivered automatically to you, you can subscribe on iTunes at rightsidenews.ca/iTunes. See you next week, everyone.
And make sure you don't get fooled by all the fake news that is out there.